Okay, welcome everybody. We will get started. First, I'd just like to acknowledge that I'm coming today on Gadigal land of Eora Nation and just pay my respects to elders past, present, and emerging. It's lovely to have you joining us. My name's Stephen Sullivan. I'm co-founder here at House of Complexity. For those of you that perhaps are new to us, we're a design studio and institute and adventures practice. And we're very interested in developing what we call transdisciplinary and complexity-informed practices here. So very much we believe that no single perspective can hold complexity, and that's why we are so interested in connecting and learning from people from all different domains. So we believe in trying to connect knowledge and transcend some of the assumptions of traditional practices. It's very much why we've started this type of ongoing talk series, where we're looking to bring people from different domains and fields, natural, social scientists, creative practitioners, philosophers, coming together to understand how they see and engage the world and what we can learn from that, and also to help challenge some of our assumptions. So very pleased to be starting the series off today with Professor Ian Buchanan, one of the leading scholars in Deleuze and Guattari, as well as critical theory and cultural studies. Very widely published, many books written as well as edited across Deleuze and Guattari and many other fields from, or subjects, I should say, politics, space, cinema, critical theory, and on it goes. Also happens to be the founding editor of Deleuze Studies, which has been really instrumental in, I would say, disseminating and engaging with Deleuze in so many different contexts. I've got somewhere I was trying to look for today. Deleuze Connections, one of the books on Deleuze and design, was one of my introductions some years ago. More recently, Ian has published a couple of books on Deleuze, particularly assemblage theory and method. And just this year, yes, there we have it, assemblage theory and effect, which I'm sure we will hear about throughout tonight. So tonight, of course, is looking at the assemblage theory and looking at it through the lens of what's going on with our relationship with algorithms. Trying to how the concept or concepts, I should say, and the method of assemblage might help us understand the influence of algorithms within our life. I'm particularly interested in this conversation because a lot of the complexity practices, being anthro-complexity or world making, being particular bodies of work that I've learned quite a bit from, have drawn from assemblage theory. And it's really, I think, has been quite helpful in orienting us to things like the nature of agency being distributed, shifting attention to the affordance of configurations, as well as even recognizing the processes of stability and ongoing transformation, and how we can start to rethink or think in terms of recomposing a field of relations rather than sort of simply problem solving in a more traditional sense. So that's probably enough from myself. How we're going to run things is we'll throw over to Ian in just a moment now. And Ian's going to take us through some thinking. I believe throughout the session, Ian will open the floor up for some questions. I'm just getting some feedback. I'll just ask everyone to jump on mute. I'm not sure. Thank you. So as we go out, if you have questions, please just drop them in the chat. And when Ian pauses, either I can read them out or we can unmute yourself and jump in and have a chat. And I'm sure we can find some time at the end to have a bit of a chat. So thanks everyone for joining us, and thanks Ian as well. Over to yourself. Sorry, just on mute there, Ian. Do I need to try to unmute you perhaps? Let me see.
No, I think it's okay now.
Oh, there you are.
Yeah, I think you actually muted me, so that was the tricky part. Well, thank you, Stephen, for that very kind introduction, and thank you for everybody who's joining me. Some of you I know personally, some of you I know the names, and I also know some of you are very early in the morning, wherever you are. So I am grateful for that. I didn't know exactly who I would be talking to, so um, I wasn't exactly sure how to pitch this. So I guess the short way, the best way to think of this is it's going to be an introduction to some Deleuzean ideas. I was told recently when I gave a talk that when they recorded it, that people only really watched 90-second grabs afterwards and not the whole talk. So I've prepared my 90-second grab for you. So the short version of my talk, and you can all go after this, is that the assemblage is what algorithms are trying to understand, to map, and to reproduce. The people who create algorithms must postulate their existence. And so they sort of presuppose the existence of an assemblage as their starting point. And all behavior focused algorithms assume that human behavior is organized in some way. And the rules and principles of that organization are what constitutes the assemblage. So I should say there's a gazillion different kinds of algorithms, and I would not pretend to be an expert in algorithms per se. The algorithms that interest me are the ones that relate to cultural productions, if you like, and what are known as matching services or recommendation services. So like when you're on Amazon or Netflix and you read a book or you watch a show or something, then the machine will basically say, well, if you like this, you will probably like that, or you might like this, you might like that. The same kinds of algorithms are at work in dating apps. If you like this person, you might like that person, and so on. So I'm quite interested in that as a problematic. How do you begin to think about how to distinguish between these different things? And so in a sense, that's what an algorithm does. But that algorithm presupposes that our choices, that our tastes, that our interests are actually fundamentally organized, that they're not simply random, okay? And most people, if you ask them, do you like this or do you like that, are able to answer that question if they'd had some exposure. They might say, well, I don't really like sport, but I don't mind watching soccer or, whatever. We all have ways by which we think about how we organize our taste and our sense of what we like. So what I would call then assemblage analysis involves trying to discern those rules. And I should say that in an interview, Deleuze was asked about, the idea of the assemblage, and he said that they saw it as an intervention into behavior studies. Okay, so a lot of the ways by which assemblage theory has developed has more or less ignored this fact that Deleuze and Guattari were fundamentally interested in the question of behavior, and that the idea of the assemblage was intended as an intervention into that field. And Guattari was quite explicit about this in the 1984 translation of a collection of his essays called The Molecular Revolution. He provides a glossary, and at the end of that glossary, he has the word assemblage or agencement, as it was in French, and says that it replaces Freud's notion of the complex. So the idea of the Oedipal complex in Deleuze Guattari's language is essentially the Oedipal assemblage. Okay, so it is the organization of desire, if you like, the organization of our tastes, and ultimately a way of thinking about behavior. It's also important to recognize that Deleuze and Guattari did not use the assemblage as a standalone concept, which is how it tends to be used outside of their work. So people like Jane Bennett and DeLander and so forth just use the assemblage and more or less ignore everything else. But in Deleuze and Guattari's work, that's absolutely not the case, and you'll never find the concept by itself. It is always part of a sort of multidimensional approach that, at a minimum, would include the notion of the abstract machine and the body without organs, as well as the ideas of territorialization and deterritorialization. Now, I will give you some definitions of some of these terms as we go along, but the short version will be something like this. The abstract machine is essentially can be, decoded as history, if you like, or rather it is the presupposition of what must be presupposed for a given number of assemblages to coexist at the same time. Okay, so only in certain conditions can assemblages coexist. Okay, as history changes, and you can think of this in very simple terms like fashion, right? People used to wear hats and gloves; they don't wear them anymore. Whatever assemblage that was part of no longer coexists with our sense of how we should dress today. Okay, so the abstract machine is fundamentally a presupposition about the coexistence of assemblages. Whereas the body that organs is, if you like, the condition of existence. It's the sense of taste, if you like, or desire that must exist for this particular assemblage to have any kind of place in our world. Now, the concept of the assemblage itself is notoriously difficult to define, of course, as the other ones are. And as I have written elsewhere, it's important to remember that the original French word agencement it was in fact that word rather than assemblage. Assemblage, although it is a French word, we use it in an English way. So I always laugh when I'm at conferences and people talk about assemblages. It's not the original word. And the agencement is, you can translate it many ways, but one of the ways by which I think it's useful to translate it is to see it as a notion of an arrangement, okay, as opposed to the assemblage. Assemblage is not a mistranslation by any means, but arrangement is a comparable translation. And in some ways, it's a better translation because it gives you that sense of the organization of things, how things are arranged, and arrangements are always spatio and temporal. So one of the problems of trying to define the assemblage is as soon as you point to an example of an assemblage or something that you want to call an assemblage, it immediately reifies it and turns it into a thing when it's precisely not a thing that we are talking about, not even a collection of things. Rather, what we are talking about is what holds a group of things together. So, mindful of this problem, let me offer the following restrictive definition, severely restrictive definition, as Deleuze Guattari put it. As they say, the preferred way of proceeding is with a severely restricted definition. An assemblage can be said to exist when two parallel formalizations of content and expression are found to be in a state of reciprocal presupposition. So that's more or less what Deleuze and Guattari say. I'm using their words. An abstract machine, which, as I said, we can substitute the word history, is necessary to create the conditions for this state of affairs. Now, there are two key phrases here in this definition, both of which tend to get ignored or left out or forgotten. And they are the idea of parallel formalizations and reciprocal presupposition. For something to be considered formalized, it must exhibit both a principle of unity and a principle of selection. We must be able to say what the rules of inclusion and exclusion are. So, for example, the fact that we can differentiate between reggae, disco, or fantasy and science fiction, melodrama and pornography, and of course between music, literature, and visual arts, is a function of these two principles, because however blurry the lines are between these genres, on the basis of a handful of traits, we can nevertheless say with confidence what does not belong in them. And we can say with equal confidence what is distinctive about them. And when I used to give this lecture to undergraduates in order to get their attention back again, I would always remind them of the fact that at a certain point in history, a whole bunch of people were employed at Google, and their sole job was to teach the machine what is the difference between a male nipple and a female nipple. Male nipple good, female nipple bad. And they had to look at literally billions of pictures and write the code in order to make those kinds of distinctions. So if you want to start to think about what an algorithm is, it's that. It's beginning to find the rules that enable you to distinguish between those two things. And the more refined the rules are, the more unerring the distinction between them will be. I'm not going to continue using that particular analogy, though it would be fun. For example, in the case of reggae, the form of content is defined by the beat, which is syncopated, whereas in disco, the beat is regular. And even though reggaeton would seem to blur the lines between them, it is equally clear that both are different from heavy metal and country. In my former life, I used to be a nightclub DJ. And there are, of course, other musical factors one could point to relating to key, to pitch, to meter, vocalization, and so on, which give reggae its distinctive sound. On the side of expression, there is a different set of formalizations that evolve separately but in parallel with reggae. For example, Rastafarianism, the normalization of marijuana use, Jamaican nationalism, Pan-Africanism, and so on. And these in turn relate to other formalizations. So when we speak of reggae as an assemblage, we are referring to a situation in which these two formalizations of content and expression have been brought into a state of reciprocal presupposition. And again, when I'm talking to undergraduates, but this probably doesn't have resonance anymore. But I was at a conference in Sweden last year, and one of the things I was telling the Swedish people there is that at a certain point in history, Australia was the biggest fan base for ABBA in the world. And so I've always thought, there's a fascinating study to be written about why 1970s Australia was the absolute hotbed of ABBA fandom anywhere in the world. What was the set of presuppositions that brought those two things together? And it's quite extraordinary. Even the ABBA movie was made in Australia, although sadly the Australian lead in that particular film is now in prison as a pedophile. So as Deleuze Guattari take pains to point out, the relationship between the form of content and form of expression cannot be mapped onto the semiotic relationship between the signifier and the signified. And now that the semiotic turn, which was once so vital in the humanities in the 1960s and 70s, now that's faded as a kind of distant memory, this particular bit of advice feels a bit less urgent. But the point is important because it means that the form of expression does not refer to the form of content. So it's really important that you don't see one as referring to the other for its meaning. They exist in a state of reciprocal presupposition. And this is clear, I think, or I hope, in the example I've given. The discourses relating to Rastafarianism, the normalization of marijuana use, Jamaican nationalism, Pan-Africanism, and so on, all exist independently of each other and independently of reggae music, and in no way depend on reggae music for their meaning. So the form of expression cannot be construed as the meaning of the form of content. So in other words, it's a very, very new way of thinking about semiotics. Rather than sort of signifier to signified, here's the sign, here's the meaning. It's I guess you could think of it in terms of resonance, that these two completely separate things are now resonating with one another to produce a new set of meanings. Similarly, at the level of music, the form of content of reggae in no way depends on the form of expression for its development. One cannot correlate its syncopated beat with the precepts of Rastafarianism. Just to take one example, it might just as easily have sounded like gospel music. So the question posed by the concept of the assemblage then is how and under what circumstances did these two formalizations come to presuppose one another, such that the distinctive rhythm of reggae music calls to mind an entire cultural phenomenon composed of Rastafarianism, etc., etc. By the same token, how and why did Rastafarianism settle on reggae as the sound most opposite to its beliefs? What kinds of assemblages or assemblages was needed to bring about the conjunction of these quite different elements in such a way that they appear to have been conjoined since birth? So one of the other things that I'm saying here is that one of the things that have been taken from Deleuze Guattari is this kind of idea that everything is connected. But if you start from the principle that everything is connected, it's almost a kind of null hypothesis, because now if everything is connected, then so what? You can't really do anything with that. So actually what's more interesting is to start from the principle that it's quite surprising that anything is connected, and try to understand, well, how are these quite separate things? How do they become connected? How do they become necessary to one another? And they maintain their distinctiveness, but something brings them into a state of mutual presupposition such that they resonate and they are now, stronger than they were before. And so the idea of the rhizome, which is often talked about and is turned into a kind of, almost a mantra, the way to think about that is that it's really a way of thinking about the connection between things, that there is no obvious linear linkage between them. There is no reason why this kind of music should be connected with this kind of ideology or belief in the world. There's nothing that links them directly, right? And so that's rhizomatic, because there is no linear direction that you could get from one to the other. So the question is, well, what enables these two things to come together? So the assemblage problem, if you like, is ultimately a question of connections and combinations. Why is this composite of sounds, the formalization of content, with this composite of discourses, the formalization of expression? Why do they go together? Why here? Why now? And then the crucial methodological point here is that when it comes to assemblages, we should not assume that everything can or does combine with everything else, okay? And that's a really kind of important point. This only happens on what they call the body-led organs, or the plane of immanence. And this is forgotten by all of the many iterations of assemblage theory, which simply ignore the idea of the plane of immanence, because they just want to focus on things. So they all assume that Deleuze Guattari say everything can be connected to everything else. They do say that about the rhizome, but what they fail to say is that this can only take place on a plane of immanence. And if you think about it, this must be the case. The combination of a material thing, such as a musical sound, and a non-material thing, such as an affective response, cannot occur on a physical plane. You can't sort of glue your affective response onto a piece of music. The combination of those two things can only occur on a virtual plane, the plane of immanence. And it has to be emphasized, I think, that the combinations found in assemblages are not random. They are always purposeful in a sense. And it makes no sense to call them random, as Bennett does, because it simply reduces the word to an assemblage. So, sorry, to an adjective. And in assemblages, there is always a system to be found in every combination, even if that system only reveals itself after the fact. All right, I've been talking for a fair while now. So does anyone have any questions? You want me to clarify anything before I continue? No? I assume that means I've explained everything perfectly, which I'm always pleased to know. So assemblages, as we come to understand them, develop as much by what they include as what they exclude, which is why they cannot be understood solely in terms of scale, which is more or less Delander's argument that assemblages get bigger over time. We cannot arrive at reggae simply by adding one sound to another in an aggregated fashion. There are rules of selection. So it was developed by artists choosing this sound rather than that sound, and building up what Deleuze and Guattari refer to as optional rules for themselves about what constituted the sound they were looking for. Now, the optional rules may feel obligatory in the context of a given assemblage because they are immanent to the assemblage, which is to say they arise from the assemblage itself, but they're still optional because the assemblage does not collapse if they are not heeded. So reggae is still reggae if it's played out of key, someone gets the beat wrong. The rules belong to the order of what Deleuze and Guattari call the abstract machine. And they define the abstract machine as like the diagram of an assemblage. It draws the lines of continuous variation, while the assemblage treats variables and organizes their relations as a function of that. So the assemblage decides, in other words, which variables will be treated as constant or obligatory rules, and which variables can be treated as fluid, but nevertheless require those rules to give it a framework and an identity. And this is generally worked out via experimentation. And one of the simplest ways to look at this and to try to understand it is to simply watch any game of sport. So, for example, if you're watching rugby, which rules can be changed before it ceases to be rugby? Like if you get rid of the rule that the ball must be passed backwards at all times, it immediately stops being rugby. It starts to become AFL. But if you have a rule that says there can be only 6 tackles or there can be 4 tackles or whatever, it's still rugby, but you've modified how the game is played. So there is a difference between optional rules and obligatory rules. Some rules, if you change them, the game collapses. It's no longer that. Other rules just modify how it is played, but it's still essentially that particular kind of game. And you can do the same thing with music. There's sort of a variation in how fast the beat is. And at a certain point, it becomes something you can't listen to. But within that, there's a fair spectrum of beats from about 40 beats a minute to 120 beats a minute. It's still music. It's just changing the tempo. So you can think of a reggae band, the decisions they make in a jam session. We can vary the pitch, the beat. We can add bagpipes, whatever. And on some questions, the answer will be no. We can't do that because it will destroy the sound of what we're trying to achieve. But in other circumstances, it will be yes, even though it seems to go against the rules. So, for example, famously, AC/DC have bagpipes in A Long Way to the Top. So, as I said, in most iterations of assemblage theory, the idea of the body-that organs as a plane of immanence is ignored. And this is a problem because it has a very important role to play in their work, because it is the locus, if you like, of the power of selection. And that's the best way to understand the body-that organs, as a power of selection. And in that sense, it has been comparatively little explored. So processes like discerning, sensing, responding, and reacting, and so on, are all the sort of typical functions of what a body that organs does. It's the processes whereby we decide what is in and what is out. So the discernment of materials, if you like, simply means identifying the types of interactions and encounters that will sort of enhance our particular assemblage. And those materials can be absolutely anything. So the model for the body-that organs in Anti-Oedipus was Marx's notion of capital. And they say that capital functions as the divine presupposition of productivity rather than its product. Now, while this is important, the reason why this is important is because what they talk about is the way by which capital comes into being, and it does so aggregatively and slowly. But once it does come into being, it then has a retroactive effect on everything else, such that it now becomes the presupposition. Okay, so our relationship to it changes quite dramatically. And in terms of our own desires and our own behaviors, we don't really recognize the moment at which a particular way of being in the world suddenly becomes our way of being in the world. But once it does, it has a retrospective effect such that we can't imagine being any other way in the world. And that would be a function of the idea of the body-that organs. So it can be compared to the idea of that Bourdieu talks about of habitus and the idea of disposition. It's something that is produced aggregatively, but we don't really feel it adding together. But once it's in effect, we now feel as though we are subordinate to it. I think one of the ways that it's useful to think about this is to think about it in terms of the way that the internet has evolved. In the early days of the internet studies, people talked about the internet as a body-that organs because it seemed disembodied and so forth. But I don't think that's a particularly useful way to think about it. So I want to suggest a different way. And that was with the arrival of search engines. So, it's hard to believe that there was a time before Google, and certainly our children have got absolutely no concept that there was ever a time before Google. And, you use card-filed indexes in libraries to find stuff, which is simply unimaginable today. And so Google's history, in a way, is kind of indicative of what the body-that organs looks like. So Google didn't invent online shopping by any means, but the company's rise to global dominance of the advertising industry, and they own a huge chunk of it, has coincided with it. They didn't start out as an advertising company. They were far too highbrow for such things, but eventually wanted to make money, so they turned their attention to it. And it was realized that every time somebody searched for something, that they could basically be shown a product at that moment. And thus the idea of sort of personalized online advertising was born. And every internet company has since tried to figure out how to use all this data that they collect on a daily, kind of basis to not only predict consumer behavior, but also to actively influence it and even create it. And this is where algorithms come into being. Algorithms are observing and collecting data about our behavior and then trying to use that data to predict it, what we will do next. And it's astonishing to me how little people seem to care about this. And again, when I was talking to my undergraduates, if you said to them, if somebody was walking around beside you, kind of looking over your shoulder at every moment of the day, what you were doing and so on, would you find that obtrusive? And they were like, yeah, of course, that'd be terrible. And you're like, but with your phone, it's doing exactly that. It tracks all your movements, it tracks all your shopping, it tracks all your searches, and it puts all those things together. Like the level of data collection, it would make the Stasi green with envy. So data has become to be regarded as so valuable in and of itself that every digital device on the market makes a profit by selling the data that it collects, which it collects for free too, because we all have to sign a waiver to say we don't object to this invasion of our privacy. And anything that can be connected to the internet sells data these days. So from the unlikely, such as the recent scandal of the Bluetooth-enabled vibrators, I'm really not kidding, collected data as well, robo vacuum cleaners and mobile phones and so on, all collected data which they on-sold. Now, often this data has absolutely nothing to do with the device's function, because the privacy waiver allows the device to scrape anything from your phone or your home Wi-Fi server. There's no reason for your robo vacuum to have access to the contacts on your phone, and yet it routinely asks for such things. So there is no limit to what data collecting services can know about our behavior these days, because a lot of what we do is online. All our transaction data, everything we purchase, movement data, and so on and so on and so on. Like if you really think about what's collected, it's quite amazing. And Shoshona Zuboff has aptly named this data-driven business model surveillance capitalism. Now, Deleuze was obviously quite prescient when he said we'd move beyond the surveillance society that Foucault used to talk about to something much more pernicious, which he called control society. And the vast and growing trove of behavioral data, as Zuboff calls it, does not by itself tell us very much about people beyond a few obvious facts. But once the data companies began to correlate the data they soon found it had enormous predictive power at the level of the individual and the population. Now, initially, they looked at the population level because it was the easiest to deal with. So they looked for trends, whether interest was increasing or declining in a particular thing, activity, fashion, and so on, just measured in terms of searches. And Google offers this as a free service. You can always look up the trend data. The trend data becomes especially valuable when it can be rendered predictive by determining which people are likely to follow which trend and why. And this is especially a class-based thing. If rich people are following something, that's far more important than if poor people are following it. And the potential of this way of thinking about data was exposed in the aftermath of the 2016 US election and Brexit vote, when it was revealed that the data analysis company Cambridge Analytica had been scouring Facebook data. So they accessed 87 million profiles without anyone's consent, including Facebook, looking for ways to identify factors that could predict or influence people to vote in a certain way. This information was used to develop highly targeted ads and so on. And as we know, Trump won. The astonishing thing about this is that Hillary Clinton was offered this exact same data service, but declined it. She didn't think it was going to be very useful. So Trump seized on it. He recognized that it was going to be useful, and Clinton turned her back on it, and we all know what happened. All right, so what I'm leading towards here is this, for us to think about the notion of the body-led organs. So the body-led organs is, I want to suggest, the practical object of the algorithm. In this respect, the algorithm offers us a living example of how schizoanalysis works in a practical sense, because the analytic questions that it asks are essentially the same for both the development of the algorithm and schizoanalysis. Deleuze puts it like this: what is your body without organs? What are your lines? What map are you in the process of making or rearranging? Schizoanalysis does not pertain to elements or aggregates, nor to subjects, relations, or structures. Okay, so it pertains only to lines. So lines are the things that connect this thing to that thing, my desire for this to my desire for that. There's something that makes those two things go together that make me the person who I am. I'm the kind of person who has this combination. And as I talk about in this book here, I should say this talk is kind of an outtake from this book. It's one of the book got too big, so eventually I'll have to do a second book. But one of the things that I was talking about in that book, which relates directly to this, is it's what is striking is the degree to which in the contemporary moment, absolutely oppositional ideas are held together by people. And if you look at what people are voting for, you have people who are supporting, Trump and One Nation, and good luck to them. But what's extraordinary is that this will be somebody who is a migrant, recent migrant, only relatively recently arrived in Australia, who is nonetheless voting for a political platform that says that migrants are the problem. And so you've got to ask yourself the question, what must be presupposed for that to occur, for somebody to be a migrant and nonetheless think that migrants are the problem, but not think that that somehow relates to them? And that's a very particular kind of state of affairs. And I think that's what the assemblage is trying to give us a language to begin to talk about. And that's what I mean by lines and how they all connect together. So they say that the assemblage or schizoanalysis only pertains to lines. And I'm suggesting it is the task of the algorithm to identify these lines, to connect the dots. Okay, so what we've seen recently in Australia is that immigration is connected to the cost of living crisis, which it's like the most sort of, banal economics 101. If there's too many people, it must have increased supply, it must have increased cost of living, and so on and so forth. There's no complexity in that. And then start to see where they interact with other lines. So lines are then flows of desire, if you like, that connect things together. So this proposal that I'm putting forward, that we treat the algorithm as a schizoanalytic apparatus, shouldn't be read as a blanket endorsement of all algorithms by any means, but it is just a way of beginning to think about schizoanalysis and a way of helping us to get our heads around it. And as I said, there are many different kinds of algorithms out there. So as I said at the start, my interest is with what's called recommendation services, and these types of algorithms, I think, offer quite a useful way of beginning to understand the notion of the body without organs. These algorithms are like art because their mechanisms are usually proprietary and therefore are closely regarded as secret, but we can nevertheless grasp them in a general way and sort of begin to understand what they're trying to achieve by looking at a couple of examples. Their goal, as the French critic Cédric Durand puts it, is to transform the cognitive conditions of a customer's access to goods. So the basic operation of a recommendation service algorithm is to perform what Deleuze and Guattari called a differential analysis, which can then be used to distinguish between elements that formerly belong to one assemblage and not another. So a differential trait, something that you identify as part of your differential analysis, is an element of an assemblage that cannot belong to two or more assemblages. So it must be unique to its set. And Deleuze's key example of this is the idea of the weapon and the tool. An axe may appear to be both a weapon and a tool, but they say this is to misunderstand the assemblage, because apprehended in terms of function within an assemblage, the warrior's axe and the forester's axe are two very different things. So there's a differential trait. There are things that separate them out. A more interesting example of this would be, I think, and again, this is something that I have sort of wrestled with, is how do you distinguish between skepticism and paranoia? Now, I've thought about this a lot because I would say for most of my teaching life, I tried to encourage my students to be skeptical. And I never thought that that was a problem or really ever really thought about it at all in anything other than positive terms until COVID hit. And then suddenly, where I had for years been saying that it's sensible to be skeptical about the advances of modern medicine, we were suddenly then faced with people who are, radically anti-vax, okay, or anti the idea of getting a COVID vaccine, even though they'd had a measles vaccine and a mumps vaccine, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And so therefore you had this kind of new thing that cropped up that was no longer simply skepticism and had crossed over into paranoia. And it's recognizable as paranoia because of that sheer contradiction in the way by which it was mobilized. And it's an example of what in sort of political terms is known as a U-shaped graph, whereby people arrive at comparable positions, paranoia and skepticism, by different paths, and they kind of are looking at one another and kind of look the same, but they are nonetheless miles apart. And so I think that one of the things that assemblage theory should be interested in is trying to map those different lines, how they can lead people in completely different paths. So recommendation algorithms follow something, a line of reasoning like this, because it's important for them to know that someone who wants to buy an axe to split logs isn't necessarily interested in buying an axe to split heads. Therefore, every choice has to be understood in terms of the assemblage it presupposes, its context, if you like. But whether this is the right assemblage for a particular customer isn't always knowable in advance. So the assemblage in this instance is kind of a fancy word for context, which has been one of the hardest nuts to crack for AI, hence the need for huge data sets in their large language models. And the algorithm in this regard is a kind of experimental knowledge production in Deleuze's sense, because its calculations are validated or invalidated solely by action. Either someone chooses a suggested product or service or they do not. And there's no way of knowing ahead of time whether someone will like a particular product recommended to them, irrespective of how closely it matches their profile and so on. So algorithms then draw on a wide range of indicators. This is the part that I find fascinating, including the standard social research categories of age, gender, race, postcode, profession, and so on. But the most important indicator is willingness to take the plunge and actually choose something. So the most important data is the choice points where people buy this thing, not that thing. And the decision to choose provides two crucial types of information. It indicates a willingness and capacity to make a decision about a given option and a general indication of what type of content prompts that action. And it is these two signals that attract the interest of advertisers who then bid to put their product in front of a consumer via an in-app advertisement. So key examples of recommendations that services people are familiar with, such as playlist suggestions on Apple Music or Spotify or whatever, all follow this kind of process. But what's really interesting is then to start to think about this in detail. What is it about this song that makes you want to listen to that song, or makes the algorithm thinks if you like this, you might like that? And in this sense, these services can be understood as a form of cultural programming. And in a sense, it's not new. We've had cultural programming through TV and radio and so on for more than a century. They all engage in it too. But in contrast to these older forms, Amazon and Google and so on offer a highly personalized service. It is not simply the case that broadcast media has been replaced by narrowcast media or even ultra niche media. Today, cultural programming is aimed at specific individuals, understood in terms of their social types and the assemblages they participate in. So one important feature these contemporary cultural programming apparatuses share, though, with legacy media is that they are in the business of the need to retain attention, which can be understood as an affective state because it implies continuous desire to keep doing what one is doing, whether that is watching a specific show or just simply watching whatever is on. And these are, if you like, two separate dimensions of affect. And we can use this to think about what the body of that organs is. So there is the desire to sustain that affective state and the desire to keep doing what we are doing. So in this sense, it is comparable to the idea of the drive in Freud. So every time we flick between channels, radio stations, or skip a song on a playlist, we are essentially performing maintenance work on our body of organs, doing what is necessary to sustain a particular affective state. And all forms of media want to plug into this mode of affect in some way and hold on to it to effectively monetize it. And this is far more difficult today than it was in the golden ages of radio and TV, because the competition is substantially greater, both in terms of the extent of new media offerings and the specificity of choices available. So while it is possible to classify our digital devices as apparatuses of capture, we shouldn't thereby assume that the only reason we find them enthralling is because they've somehow lured us against our will. These devices do not generate the capacity that we have for attention that we devote to them, nor do they create the desire to be fascinated in the way that we can be. So, in other words, desire precedes the devices. The devices somehow tap into something that was already there. And I would tend to say that, digital devices are probably the most effective and efficient devices we've yet created at capturing our attention. But they would not work if some part of our affect was not already predisposed towards the 0-degree state of desire inherent in the passive viewing practices that we refer to as doom scrolling. So doom scrolling, I would suggest, is the body of that organs par excellence. It's a very particular state of desire. It appears to be caused by the device, but in fact, we use the device to generate and sustain it as a kind of attention plateau, a field of desire characterized by pure receptivity and a kind of absence of boredom. And this 0 degree of desire is characterized in Anti-Oedipus as a kind of shutting down of desire, such that the subject lapses into a catatonic state, for which Artaud is the emblem and Lindner's boy with a machine is the image. Artaud wanted to be free from the demand to be this or to be that, to think this or to think that, and so on, that came from inside him as much as outside of him. And in order to have that, he was willing to shut down and disengage from the world. So in 1,000 Plateaus, Deleuze and Guattari came to realize that this state of the 0 degree of desire is not necessarily negative, much less unhealthy. So they reconfigured it as to accommodate an affirmative mode. And the 0 degree can also then refer to a state of not wanting to desire anything else other than what one is presently doing, to keep watching TV and so on. So we can positively refer to concentration and focus then along these lines, or negatively refer to it as hyperattention, hyperfocus. And both would be examples of what I would suggest we could call undisruptible desiring. And Deleuze and Guattari borrow Bateson's term plateau to describe this state of being. So the 1,000 plateaus are really these undisruptible states of desire, which they describe as continuous, self-vibrating regions of intensities whose development avoids any orientation toward the culmination point or external end. So, doom scrolling par excellence. And they go on to say that it is a regrettable characteristic of the Western mind to relate expressions and actions to exterior or transcendent ends, instead of evaluating them on a plane of consistency on the basis of their intrinsic value. So the contemporary critiques of social media, which frame it as a form of distraction, fall into this trap precisely because they start from the assumption that this undisruptible desire is inherently problematic, because people are disengaged from the world, and that whatever is capturing our attention on social media must therefore be somehow unworthy. And as a consequence, not much attempt is made to understand this process of desiring for itself. By contrast, people who construct algorithms, they take absolutely the opposite view. They place a premium on this form of undisruptible desiring and want to find out how to generate it and sustain it. So I'm suggesting then that the notion of undisruptible desiring offers us a useful opportunity to further refine our understanding of Deleuze Guattari's concept of affect and the body-led organs. Because the body-led organs is not a thing, much less a body. It is rather a very particular state of mind which straddles the unconscious and conscious. We are not conscious of desiring processes that give rise to the body-led organs, but we are conscious of the feeling it gives to us. We do not know why we have the feeling that we can or cannot do something, but we certainly feel that sense of capacity or incapacity. We can either rise to meet the day or we cannot. And of course, there are stages in between. So again, what I've been saying is that the idea of the algorithm is really an attempt to try to map all this out. And I realize that I've probably got more words here than I'm going to have time for. So I will take the opportunity to stop there and thank you all. And if you have questions, do feel free to send them my way.
Thank you so
Thanks
much,
very much.
Ian. Oh, very good. We'll give everyone a couple of minutes to either share questions in the chat or please feel free to unmute, jump onto camera. Maybe while I've got you in, I'll just start just a clarifying question. So I had a friend who actually said that he had stopped using Spotify because he felt it was actually shaping his taste in music. So I'm curious to know if you could just clarify how does that sit with what you just said then? It sounded like you were saying that algorithms sort of capture a pre-existing desire as opposed to necessarily producing the conditions through which new desire can emerge. Is that fair to say?
So I was saying that they capture it, but they want to generate, sustain, and ultimately shape it. Like they want to, push you towards the direction of staying with a particular device. So Spotify, I find it immensely fascinating. I've quite liked the fact that it's changed my listening taste because it throws in all kinds of deep cut songs that I would never have listened to before. And then I find that I like them. So there's some things that they are doing particularly well, but it raises really fascinating questions. And when you read quite a lot about Spotify, even Spotify had been astonished by, or there was a case, I can't remember the name of the band now, there was some band there was some track that was like, track number 9 on an album that hadn't been listened to for years. And suddenly it was getting heaps of play because it had found its way onto some Spotify Cool Grooves playlist and was getting millions of streams. But, originally no one ever heard it, never got radio play or whatever. And it became one of their most streamed songs. So yes, it does change how we listen to things, but you would skip past that song if they'd got it wrong in terms of how it connects to the other songs. So it opens up a very interesting set of questions. And I would suggest that your friend is probably resistant to that idea, like, fairly rigid. I like these bands, I don't like those bands, and hate it when U2 start sounding good. I don't want to listen to U2 songs, or whatever the scenario may be. And I think something like that is starting to happen. But now they're saying, well, these songs actually sound kind of the same, and it's the same kind of vibe. And so it is changing our taste, but at the same time, it's responding to our taste. And I think that's what's particularly fascinating about it. They've drilled into the songs in ways that the old radio DJs never really got into that level. And they do it electronically, right? Like they can now, in a heartbeat, have a list of songs. All of these songs have got a 120 beat, rhythm to them, and they're all the same. Like thousands of songs got exactly the same beat. And as a DJ, you'd have to listen to thousands of songs to know that. But Spotify can do it instantaneously because they've got everything as a digital file.
How would you think about that in terms of processes of territorializing or re-territorializing?
So the best way to think about the idea of territory and territorialization is Deleuze and Guattari define territory as that which has a home value, right? So you could say that your sense of taste is something that you feel at home in, right? And so deterritorialization would be something that shifts you out of that sense of this is my home sound. And it's now becoming deterritorialized because now I'm no longer fully comfortable in that, but I'm becoming reterritorialized and more comfortable in something else. So our sense of the expansion of our taste, palette, if you like, is a process of deterritorialization and reterritorialization. We moved out of one thing that we felt at home in, and we've become comfortable in another thing that we are at home in as well. It can be negative as well, but that the simplest way to think of it is, and that's how they define it, territory has a home value.
Awesome, thank you. I can see we've got some questions in the chat there. Jean, do you want to unmute yourself and ask your question? I can just read it out for you here. So
I can
some
read
clarity.
it as well.
Oh, you can see that? Excellent. Cool.
Yeah. Which question do you want me to start with?
It looks like, I think from what I
The
can see, the top
optional
one
and
is
obligatory rules.
That's it, yeah.
So does the delineation of the optional and obligatory rules arise imminently, or who defines which rules are which? I think, yes, imminently in the sense of they are imminent to a particular assemblage. So, within a form of music, there are obligatory and optional rules. But I guess it's the community of people who live by and produce that assemblage. Latour has a really interesting concept, which he calls the police function. And it's not a concept that gets talked about a lot, but he says basically in a sense, every assemblage has a police function, that there is some part of the assemblage, some ways by which the assemblage polices its own boundaries. Whereby people will, the people who like musicians will say, well, that's country or it's not country, or that's rock and roll, it's not rock and roll, it's disco, it's not disco. And so I think it's policed by the community, but the conditions under which they do police it change over time. So the rules, the rules are obligatory if they cannot be changed without changing the thing, right? So country can't have a disco beat, or it can. If you say absolutely it cannot have a disco beat, then it's an obligatory rule. But if you say, well, why not? It can have a disco beat, then it's an optional rule. And in a sense, that is up to the community. So, the idea of the assemblage is not independent of the people who live it. Deleuze Guattari say that desire can only manifest as an assemblage. So every assemblage is a manifestation of desire. If it's a manifestation of desire, then it is also implicitly a manifestation of human interactions. So I don't know if that answers the question, but hopefully it does. I'm thinking of Michelle Callan's work on market agencement. What do you think of AI? Is it a kind of market agencement? Now we have the production of chips, data centers, fear about jobs loss, the global fetishism for tech stocks, not to mention tech bubbles, etc., etc. Are we hitting the kind of breakdown of the machine soon? There's a lot there in that question, I have to say. I'm not sure that, I suppose that some kind of a breakdown is always about to happen with capitalism. So that's entirely possible. But clearly, there's been a lot of work on the degree to which algorithms are, functioning in terms within the financial markets. So the ultra fast processes now, so that all the stock exchanges, they have data centers built right next to them, and the trades within nanoseconds of announcements and so forth. So yeah, the algorithms are changing the way by which stock trading is being done. It's much faster than it ever used to be, and it operates on much smaller margins because it's operating at a scale that's sort of below the level of human perception, and at a speed greater than human perception. So absolutely, it's completely changing the market. I'd like to ask about the ethics and use of ethics of care with respect to algorithms. Please explain a bit more about who is responsible for the cultivation of one's body and extended body, or is it more we are being influenced, but there is an element of allowance. We allow ourselves to be affected, yet we cannot control how this is done. Also, Spotify doesn't pay musicians a living wage, so please avoid it. Yes, well, the problems with Spotify are many. Um, um, I think that the ethics of algorithms would be the same as relates to any form of governance or any kind of business. There's no new ethics that are needed with respect to algorithms. Algorithms simply do things faster and in a more automated way than what we used to do. I mean, people who traded on the stock market used to look at stocks, evaluate them, and make buy decisions, sell decisions, and so on. Machines are now doing this exactly the same thing. So I don't think we need a new set of ethics to go with what's coming with respect to AI. But clearly, we do need to pay more attention to it, because there is always the sense by which if the machine's doing it, then we're not responsible. And we saw that in Australia, that in the Australian context, the idea of robo-debt, which unfortunately has not gone away and is coming back. So that the new model for the NDIS will be to use an automated assessment of people's eligibility and so forth. So I think it's a really crucial question, because what's kind of happening is that if something is done by the machine, then somehow the ethics are translated and transposed onto the machine, and the humans who created it are sort of able to wash their hands of it. So I don't think we need a new set of ethics, but we absolutely need to maintain and be vigilant about what we think about ethics, and not allow for the idea that if the machine's making the decision, that somehow means that it operates outside of an ethical set of principles. So yeah, it will be a really important kind of problem for us to pay attention to. And it's pretty clear that the current governments in most of the Western world are nowhere near trying to do that. Wondering if you have any thoughts on the mental health and well-being impacts of many of the concepts, algorithms, surveillance, so on and so forth, particularly on young people. And yeah, so I mean, I think what's interesting about the ways by which people have been trying to think about the impacts of AI, and a lot of the social media bans for young people were, if you like, psychologically based, right? So, but I think what has been neglected and not thought about enough is the neurological impacts. So there are, if you like, three ways of thinking about the brain. There is neurological, the psychological, and the psychiatric. So the neurological is like the electrical side of your brain, the sort of processing of it. And the psychological is the thoughts, and the psychiatric is, in a way, the chemical aspects of it. So psychiatrists, and I don't mean to malign them, but psychiatrists can prescribe pills that alter the brain chemistry. Psychologists, you can talk to them and they help you to organize your thoughts. And neurologists can, and sometimes it will become more physical, or they'll do surgery and so forth, alter the actual physical structure of the brain. What is not known enough is the degree to which our interaction with digital media is changing the neurological dimension. And the problem with that is that it sort of falls below the radar. Like, you know, we can kind of be concerned about the content on our phones. We can sort of think, oh my God, our kids have got access to pornography in the way that we didn't. You know, when I was a kid, teenage boy, if I wanted pornography, it had to be under the counter or whatever, you know, it wasn't easy to get. Now, pornography, within less than a second, you can have it on your phone. And we tend to think of social media in terms of content. But the neurological side of things has more to do with the way by which our attention is becoming hyper-focused. And the sort of doom scrolling is as much about the neurological as it is about the psychological, but we worry about the psychological. But in my view, we should be at least as much worried about the neurological. And there's already emerging evidence that it's leading to a sort of transformation of the way by which neurological pathways are being formed. So we don't know what this is going to look like, but you know, you have to think about this as a global experiment involving literally billions of people, for which there was never even an instance of an ethical conversation about whether any of this was going to be good for us or not. So yes, I think it is a significant problem for mental health that we're not talking about enough, and we are clearly, only at the beginning of a wave of what this is going to look like. People like me, I grew up in a generation before mobile phones, so all my, processes were formed in the absence of it. But now when I look at students and kids coming through, their processes are formed in the presence of it, and they're very, very different in their mental approaches. And we don't know what that's going to look like down the line. So certainly I think it's something we do need to be worried about. And then someone's got, I can read my comment. Okay. John, you're up. If you're still with us.
I think you may have already covered it. It was John. Yeah, it was the question earlier about ethics of care.
Oh, sorry.
Although there was a follow-up, a clarification. I'm not sure, John, if you are still on, feel free to jump in, but there was a clarification saying, I suppose I mean that your extended body only exists if you create it. So those who don't use will have an extended body even if they see themselves outside of its control.
Right. That I'm not sure about. So the police function is found in Latour's book on social assemblages. Anna is, I hope I pronounced your name correctly. I'm assuming that the Norwegian E is the same as the German E. How do people working in technology and AI regard my engagement with algorithms? I have no idea. I don't know if they've read it yet. So I have to wait and find out. Hopefully they'll be sufficiently horrified that it counts as a critique. And then from Thomas, skepticism, paranoia, but probably missed something due to my limited knowledge. Could I talk a bit more how it connects on the ideas of the assemblage and how schizoanalysis can help? Yeah, I skimmed it pretty fast because I didn't want to be too provocative or controversial. But I've always liked Lacan's definition of paranoia. He says, even if people are out to get you, if you are thinking that, you are paranoid. So paranoia is defined by a sense of persecution, whereas skepticism, I suppose, is more open-ended. We don't feel persecuted as such. And that's what I find really interesting. Like, I, as someone who teaches critical thinking, I've always tried to teach people to be skeptical. You can't and shouldn't trust the government to always have your best interest at heart. There's abundant evidence that they do not. But by the same token, that doesn't mean you should think that the government only has your harm at heart. And I remember during the sort of COVID thing, where the sort of more conspiracy-oriented people were saying, "Oh, the government is trying to do this," and you're like, "Well, if people are saying, almost in the same breath, that the government basically couldn't organize a booze up in a brewery," and you're kind of like, which is it? They can organize a conspiracy enough that thousands of people are dying, and at the same time they can't seem to organize to deliver bread or whatever. So which is it? And so those kinds of moments of dissonance tend to make you think, well, this is paranoia rather than skepticism. And so the idea of schizoanalysis, I suppose, is to raise the question of, and that's what I was saying before about the idea of combinations. How do these things sit together? And are they contradictory? Are they consistent? Do they create a line, or do they sort of branch off all over the place? So I don't know if that answers your question, but Deleuze and Guattari always say that what's important is for us to try to refine problematic. So I think the problem of trying to distinguish between skepticism and paranoia, even if we can't fully resolve it, is a useful problem because it helps us to think more clearly about those two things. And I would say you would want to encourage people to be skeptical, but you wouldn't want to encourage them to be paranoid. But it's a very fine line between those two things. And as I said, it's that sort of U-shaped diagram. They're both looking at the same thing, but arrived at it by different paths. Extended body only exists if you create it. So those who don't have an extended body, even if they see themselves outside its control. I'm not sure I fully understand that. John, do you want to jump on and explain that a little bit? Okay. Well, sorry, I'm not sure I get the question fully. But
We
you can always
may
email me afterwards.
may have lost John. Ian, I wonder if in wrapping up, I very much appreciated your book, Assemblage Theory and Method, and obviously you were addressing some, say, common misinterpretations there. Could you share a little bit about assemblage theory and effect and what you're doing with this book?
Yeah, sure, delighted to. So I guess that um, I suppose one part of me is kind of a Deleuze purist, and I've always taken the view that we should try to understand what Deleuze and Guattari are doing for themselves before we move off and do something else. But at the same time, we can approach their work with a kind of skepticism and think, well, is it useful or not? And to me, that's a much more useful question. So I became interested in the idea of affect because in a way, that's sort of what the body without organs is really about. It's the idea of how we feel about something. And I think in a way, what they wanted to do with the idea of the body without organs is to create something like a topology of our affect, where affect would be our capacity to interact with the world. And it seemed to me quite a useful way to begin to think about our contemporary situation that was different from what I feel about this or what I feel about that, but rather what is my capacity to feel anything at all, and how is that structured so that I am predisposed towards the world in particular kinds of ways, and so how does the world around me change that predisposition, but also how can I change my predisposition towards the world? And that seems to me that one of the questions that Deleuze and Guattari are asking, and in a way, that's what they're defining schizophrenia as. That schizophrenia is a profound disruption of our affect as our capacity to interact with the world. It profoundly disrupts it. And we start to interact with the world. If we have schizophrenia, we interact with the world in a very different kinds of ways, but in ways that cannot easily be understood by somebody who does not share that affect, who does not share that way of thinking about the world. And their whole argument with Freud was essentially that he was wrong in thinking that you could simply trace back to some moment and say, oh, well, the particular hallucinations and so forth that they're having necessarily relate to this moment in their childhood or whatever. It said, look, completely wrong. Rather, they have to be understood imminently. There is something that's happening, and it's a whole new way of seeing the world. It has its own metaphysics, essentially. And that to me relates back to the idea of affect and paranoia. I suppose it was during the COVID years and a number of paranoid sort of stories that were circulating. It made me really interested in how do people get so fixated on these absolutely paranoid ways of thinking about the world, and why are they so unmovable? Like the thing about paranoia is that they do not respond to facts. You can say, well, it's manifestly clear that people haven't been dropping dead in the streets from the vaccines. And they're like, well, no, it's just been hidden. You've got to look deeper. You've got to look deeper. And so there was this imperviousness to sort of factual response. So for me, that became very fascinating. And that's why I wanted to start theorizing in terms of affect. I don't know that I fully do that with the book. I think the book is really a kind of starting point of saying, well, what does affect mean within Deleuze and how does it fit within the total system? But hopefully it creates a platform for other people to go on and do those kinds of inquiries.
look,
Ree is saying that isolation feels like, yes, I agree. There's quite a few people actually working on a bunch of colleagues who've been working on the hikikomori in Japan, and trying to use Deleuze Guattari to understand that as a phenomenon.
excellent. Well, it looks like no more questions. Just a massive thank you for uh, being here with us, and thank you, Ian, for being the very first of what is going to be an ongoing series of conversations. I very much have enjoyed some of your earlier work and looking forward to picking up a copy of Assemblage Theory and Effect as well. Having a read of that, I may be shooting you some questions to clarify some things for me.
Feel free, and happy to do another talk again at some point if you would like.
Excellent. Absolutely. I'm sure we will take you up on that. Thank you, everyone. Just a note as well, we do have over June a couple of other conversations coming up. On June 16th, Other Worlds Exist, Other Worlds Are Possible, looking at the idea of world making through an enactive and an assemblage lens there, and then creating deep change in June 24th. So in that instance, we're looking at change across organization, sectors, and society by top-down, bottom-up reframing, as well as a studio model as a distinct kind of innovation infrastructure. So I would say, in some respect, building on the notion of assemblage theory here and understanding what that means in an innovation and design context there. Thank you all once again. Much appreciated. Thanks, Ian.
So yeah.